Yo, YouTube, what's up with your boy, Sports and Fitness Rants? I'm back, guys. Click that like button. Subscribe to my channel. What's up, y'all? Welcome back, guys. Welcome back. Got another great video for you guys today. As usual, you guys know the deal on this channel, man. We're going to put some respect on the 90s, man. We're here to stand up, right? Stop these guys from tearing down these past eras, especially the 90s, man, the era that I grew up watching. And in this video, we're going to talk about the 90s and the great two-way players of the 90s. That's right, guys. And I want to shout out Will Kinney, 8946. Will Kinney, 8946. He had left a comment saying that I should do a video on the great two-way players of the 90s to highlight, you know, what we're always talking about as it relates to all-around players, when guys played both sides. Back in the day, when you were considered an all-around player, that meant that you played offense and defense, right? You brought it on both ends. You gave effort on both ends. You were impactful on both ends. That's called two-way play. And back in the 90s, you had a lot of great two-way players. And I'm going to talk about some of these guys in this video. And I want to thank everybody out there, man. Everyone across the world, everyone across the states, guys. I am truly humbled by the support, man. I really, truly humble, guys. It really means a lot, man, because we're standing up, and you guys are standing with me. You guys are rolling with me. You guys are going back and forth with these idiots in the comment section, and I appreciate that, guys. I really do, man, because we're not going to let these people bully us. We're not going to back down from this nonsense. These guys are a bunch of cowards, man. They love to comment. That's all they can do. They can't do anything else but comment and make weird statements. That's all they do. They have nothing to put on video. They have nothing of facts or educational to say. Never. So thank you to all you guys. And you know what to do, guys. Turn the volume all the way up. Hit that play button. Remember, these videos are for educational purposes. And let's roll. So, yes, guys, once again, shout out to Will Kinney, 8946, man. We were talking about this yesterday, and we're going to talk about the great two-way players of the 90s, guys. We're going to talk about some of these guys because I really believe that a lot of people, a lot of the, quote-unquote fans of this new era, they really don't seem to understand when we're talking about all-around play, right? All-around players, right? We're talking about offense and defense. I'm not talking about a guy that can give you 25, 30 points a game, and 7, 8, 9, 10 assists, like a Trae Young or Luka Doncic, some of these guys, and they'll make it seem like these guys are great all-around players. Meanwhile, they don't play a lick of defense, not a lick of D. When I grew up watching basketball, to be considered a complete player, you had to impact both sides of the ball to a certain degree. No, you didn't have to be the greatest defensive player of all time, but you had to give the effort on the defensive end. It had to be there. It had to show up on the video footage. You had to have an impact on the defensive end to a degree. It couldn't just be you scoring and that's it. You had to have other parts of the game like the defense. So when we talk about the 90s and people try to make it seem like these guys weren't that great, we can easily point to the two-way players of the 90s, and that it highlights and exposes that as a complete lie. These guys in the 90s were straight ballers, man, and they gave effort on both ends. Both ends. And a lot of these guys that I'm going to mention in the 90s, these are all-time great two-way players. These are not just good two-way players. These are some of the greatest two-way players in the history of the game, guys, played in the 90s, right? And we think about some of the players of the last, 10, 15 years, since the 2010s, essentially, when defense has gone down the drain. You don't have two-way players like you used to have back in the day, guys. You don't. That's the problem we have when people call these guys all-around players or complete players. They're not. They play no defense. There's no effort there. So, we know the usual suspects right from the 90s, the great two-way players in the 90s. You guys know these guys. You know Michael Jordan. To me, Michael Jordan is the greatest two-way player in NBA's history, right? Yes, you can debate some other guys up there, maybe a Wilt Chamberlain, maybe a Hakeem Olajuwon, but to me, Michael Jordan is head and shoulders above these players as the greatest two-way player. No one's been able to have 10 scoring titles and be all defensive 9 times. No one's doing this. The highest career scoring average in the regular season and the postseason, right? Raising your level of play when it matters most on both ends. That's Michael Jordan. No one's been able to do it at that level for that long. Literally, Michael Jordan's entire career, he led the league in scoring and was a top defensive player. No one else has been able to duplicate that. Nobody. Not that consistently. Every single season hasn't been done. So to me, Michael Jordan is clearly the greatest two-way player of all time. Like I said, you can argue some other guys. But to me, it's Michael Jordan, right? Played in the 90s. We all know Michael Jordan, right, guys? Hakeem Olajuwon, I just mentioned Hakeem Olajuwon. Many people consider Hakeem Olajuwon the greatest defensive center. I've seen people who have made that argument, right? Okay, I can see that. To me, Hakeem Olajuwon, once again, one of the greatest two-way players in the history of the game. You could probably consider him a top 3 two-way player in the history of the game. I don't see that being a stretch of the imagination, man. So once again, Hakeem Olajuwon, another all-time great two-way player of the 90s. You know what I'm saying? Like I said, these guys are legendary two-way players. These are not just good players for the 90s. These guys would have been dominant and legendary in any era. They're some of the best of the best. These are the top guys. And this is the 90s, y'all. Who else? Think about David Robinson. Same thing. Once again, another elite two-way player. David Robinson, man. I'm telling you right now, for 8, 9, 10 seasons, man, from 1990 to about 1998, David Robinson was sensational. Right? Sensational. The only player that really outperformed him was Hakeem Olajuwon at that position. But once again, these are all two-way players in the 90s, guys. David Robinson, man. A lot of players don't look like David Robinson, and they don't move like David Robinson. David Robinson was a much superior athlete to Hakeem Olajuwon. He just didn't have the overall footwork, the skills, quote-unquote, of a Hakeem Olajuwon on the offensive end, the bag, the repertoire of Hakeem Olajuwon. Hakeem Olajuwon was a little bit more of a defensive presence, but to me, David Robinson's athleticism gave him a little bit more range than a Hakeem Olajuwon. That's just in my opinion. Not saying he's a better defensive player, he's not. Or a better player overall, he's not. But David Robinson, man, this guy is elite. Two ways, could run the floor. One of the fastest players in the NBA at that time in the 90s, guys. This guy was sensational, man. He could really move out there, man. Get blocks at a high level, the instincts, the timing, right? This is David Robinson, man. Like I said, just one of the great two-way players in the 90s of all time, David Robinson. Who else is a great two-way player of the 90s? Patrick Ewing. Talked about Patrick the other day in that video, right? The last great New York Knick. Patrick Ewing, man, one of the all-time great centers. Probably top 12, I would say, probably number 12, somewhere around there to me. Patrick Ewing, 10 to 15 in that range. You can argue he's top 10. But one of the great two-way players in NBA's history, Patrick Ewing, gave effort on both ends. It's the effort these guys gave. Right? Is Patrick Ewing the greatest center of the 90s? No, he's not. But he's one of the great two-way players. Like I said, the guy could give you 20, 22 points a game, 9, 10 rebounds, a couple of assists, give you 2 or 3 blocks a game. The leadership, the heart, the grit of Patrick Ewing. These guys were two-way players, right? They didn't sit back on offense. They gave effort on both ends. They didn't just sit back on defense for the offense. They gave effort on both ends. They were consistent on both ends. They showed up on both ends. This is the 90s. You had to play defense in the 90s. Excuse me, guys. You had to do it to be considered one of the great players of that era, right? We think about, who else? Gary Payton, one of the great two-way players in the 90s of all time, right? Gary Payton, give you 17, 18 points a game, right? Because for me, guys, a lot of these guys I was thinking about as two-way players, you had to at least have the ability to at least score 15 points a game on the offensive end. You had to at least give me that, right? Because there are a lot of great defensive players of the 90s, but to me, they weren't two-way players, right? They were great defensive players, but their offense was lacking a little bit, like a Dikembe Mutombo, for example, right? Dikembe Mutombo would maybe give you 8 to 10 points a game, maybe 12 points, right? He was a great defensive player, but when we're talking about the top two-way players, to me, Dikembe Mutombo wasn't necessarily a great two-way player. He was a very excellent defensive player, though. So you see what I'm saying, guys? But for me, Gary Payton, one of the top two-way defensive guards in the history of the game, right? Could score, could post you up on offense, and then could lock you down on defense on the perimeter. If he's not the greatest defensive point guard of all time, he's one of them, up there with Walt Clyde Frazier and Dennis Johnson. Right? These kinds of guys, right? John Stockton's, right? So Gary Payton, one of the great two-way players of the 90s. These guys are legendary. These are not so-so guys. Who else? John Stockton. I just mentioned him. John Stockton, another excellent two-way player of the 90s. John Stockton with the heart, the grit, the toughness. Right? You guys remember Gary Payton saying that John Stockton was one of the hardest players for him to guard, right? Because of John Stockton's, the way he played the game, right? Always moving around, right? Always hustling, right? This is John Stockton, man. This man was always there hustling, man. The effort, right? That's the key word for the 90s, guys, and all these other eras. It's the effort that these men gave. right? You saw the effort. They were out there competing. They gave the effort on the defensive end. It mattered to them to be great defensive players. So shout out to John Stockton, man, who always gave the effort. Let's think about his teammate, Karl Malone, another great two-way player in NBA's history. Karl Malone, what a 3-4-time all-defensive player, right? One of the greatest scoring power forwards in the history of the game, if not the greatest scoring power forward in the history of the game, right? An excellent rebounder at that position. Karl Malone, the toughness, the physical stature of a Karl Malone, the elbows flying everywhere. The toughness, the durability of Karl Malone. The man was always there. Him and John Stockton, they were always there. They were durable. They were tough. They had grit. They had heart. And Karl Malone was a very solid defensive player, man. You couldn't just post him up and push him around down low. You couldn't do it. He was stout. And we all know what he brought on the offensive end, right? So for me, Karl Malone, once again, another great two-way player of the 90s. Just a great two-way player in general. Scotty Pippen, another great two-way player, Scotty Pippen. See, people can say that I hate on Scotty Pippen on this channel. All I tell you guys on this channel, I tell you guys the facts about Scotty Pippen. I put him into proper perspective. That's all I do. I never tear him down with lies. And once again, Scotty Pippen, one of the great two-way players of the 90s. Scotty Pippen give you 16, 17, 18, 20 points a game, right? And lock you down the perimeter. Giving the effort. The one thing I've never doubted about Scotty Pippen was the effort he gave. He was out there hustling, right? Because once again, what have we talked about with Scotty Pippen, the Michael Jordan dynamic, is that there were no days off being Michael Jordan's teammate. He pushed these guys in practice, and Scotty Pippen adapted that kind of mentality, that mindset, the effort, the hustle of Michael Jordan. It rubbed off on Scotty Pippen. And Scotty Pippen was out there giving his effort on the defensive end. It mattered to him. One of the great perimeter defensive players in NBA's history, and a very great two-way player of the 90s, man. Like I said, he could give you some points, and he would lock you down on defense. He was there on both ends. It's the effort, guys. The effort. Was Scotty Pippen this great scorer or shooter? No, he wasn't. I've told you guys, he was never a scorer per se. But like I told you, he could give you 20 points on the offensive end based off of his all-around skills, the effort he gave. He could get steals and then run the break and score that way, right? Transition points, right? Things of that nature. So shout out to Scotty Pippen, another great two-way player of the 90s. Joe Dumars, once again, a forgotten player of the 90s, Joe Dumars. One of the guys that Michael Jordan said guarded him the best. Of any player that he went against, he always gave Joe Dumars his props, man. Joe Dumars, not only was he a great defensive player, he was also known for being a clutch defensive player. That's right, guys. You can also be a clutch defensive player. And Joe Dumars was known for making big-time defensive plays when it mattered most for those Detroit Pistons teams, man. That's right, guys. Joe Dumars, man, 6'4", 6'3", shooting guard. Like I said, for the Detroit Pistons, man, one of the great defensive shooting guards in the history of the NBA, guys. The history of the NBA had the quick hands, always in great position on defense, man. This guy was always there, man, giving Michael Jordan, harassing Michael Jordan, right? Making Michael Jordan earn it. Michael Jordan had steel sharpen steel, develop his skills against some of the great perimeter defensive players. And Joe Dumars could give you 17, 18 points a game and lock you up on the perimeter. This is Joe Dumars. This is the two-way player of the 90s. These are great two-way players, guys. Great. Shout out to Joe Dumars, man. Like I said, he's forgotten on that Detroit Pistons team. People always talk about Isaiah Thomas and, Dennis Rodman, rightfully so. But it was Joe Dumars, man. He was an X factor. Don't forget, guys, he was the first one to win the Finals MVP in 1989 when the Pistons won their first title. It was Joe Dumars who was the Finals MVP, guys. So shout out to Joe Dumars, one of the great two-way players of the 90s. Alonzo Mourning. We think about Alonzo Mourning, another great two-way player of the 90s, guys, right? Defensive Player of the Year award winner, could give you about 18 points a game, maybe 20 points a game, right? A solid rebounder, an excellent shot blocker, just a really great defensive player, had great instincts, right? He had the size. Alonzo Mourning, he gave the effort. This is why these guys would get dunked on. You see the posters of Michael Jordan dunking on this guy, or Clyde Drexler, or this guy, that guy, dunking on these men. That's why, because they actually attempted and tried to block shots. They gave the effort there. So you're going to get banged on every once in a while, right? It didn't stop these guys from going up and contesting. They didn't let guys just come in there. That's how the game was played in the 90s. You were going to take an elbow, a forearm, a shoulder. You guys remember the knot Scotty Pippen got in his head from Alonzo Mourning, right? In the 97 Eastern Conference Finals, right? That huge knot he had from Alonzo Mourning clobbering him down. This is the 90s, guys. Shout out to Alonzo Mourning, one of the great two-way players of the 90s. Shaquille O'Neal, to me, Shaquille O'Neal, not saying he was a great two-way player, but he was a very, very good two-way player of the 90s. That's right, guys. I told you the other day, Shaquille O'Neal and the Orlando Magic, right, in those first couple of years in LA, he was a very good defensive player. He gave the effort more consistently. His rebounding, his shot blocking was a lot better. And on offense, we all know what Shaq could do. He could run the floor, man. He could finish with power. This was Shaquille O'Neal, his early years, in his athletic prime. Shaq was a great two-way player, man. Like I said, he kind of fell off in the 2000s when he really shouldn't have. He got lazy and stuff. But in those 90s, Shaquille O'Neal was a very good two-way player, man. So shout out to Shaquille O'Neal, man. Kevin McHale. Let's think about Kevin McHale. Now, yes, Kevin McHale played in the 80s and the 90s, but he played 3, 4, 5 seasons in the 90s. But Kevin McHale was a very good two-way defensive player. A lot of people don't realize Kevin McHale was like I want to say a 5 or 6-time all-defensive player at that power forward position. And we all know Kevin McHale is regarded as one of the greatest post-up power forwards in the history of the game. His post-up game, they used to call it, he'd put you in that torture chamber, right? Kevin McHale would get you down there on that block, man, and you couldn't do nothing with him. So Kevin McHale, to me, is one of the great two-way players of the 90s, guys. Shout out to Kevin McHale, man. Like I said, a forgotten player. People, often talk about Larry Bird, and rightfully so. He was the best player. He was a leader. But Kevin McHale, man, was an excellent power forward on both ends, guys. He had those long arms, Kevin McHale. You guys see Kevin McHale out there, man. He was a solid defensive player. Very good two-way player. So shout out to Kevin McHale, man. Who else, guys, have we thought about? I think we pretty much mentioned a lot of guys. I think we mentioned, that's like 12 players that we've mentioned. I want to think about some of these other guys that are kind of a little bit lesser as far as being really good or great defensive players or two-way players. Someone like a Reggie Lewis, to me, was a very good two-way player before he died. Unfortunately, rest in peace to Reggie Lewis. But Reggie Lewis, I told you guys, when he started to come into his own around 89, 90, 91, 92, he was an excellent two-way player, man. Reggie Lewis, about 6'7", shooting guard, about 200 pounds. I told you, I saw him block Michael Jordan's jump shot, about 2 or 3 times in one game, guys. Reggie Lewis, he gave the effort on the defensive end. He was a very good two-way player. Like I said, he ended up dying tragically, so he didn't get to, play out his whole career in the 90s. But Reggie Lewis was an excellent, very good two-way player, man, early in those 90s, man. So shout out to Reggie Lewis, man. He could give you 18, 20 points a game, and like I said, really give you fits on the defensive end, man. So shout out to Reggie Lewis, man. Kendall Gill, another lesser two-way player of the 90s, but a very solid defensive player and a very solid two-way player. Kendall Gill, like I said, could give you 17, 18 points a game, maybe even 20 points a game on the offensive end. And like I said, make you work for it on the defensive end. He was excellent at creating steals and getting steals. As a matter of fact, he might even to this day have the highest steal total in a single game. I believe he had 11 or 12 steals in a single game before, Kendall Gill. But he was a very solid two-way player. Shout out to Kendall Gill. Another guy, Ron Harper, another solid two-way player of the 90s. A lot of people remember him on the three-peat Bulls where he didn't really have anything much left on the offensive end, right? He was there to play, make, and play defense, which he did very good. But Ron Harper in the late 80s into the early 90s was an excellent two-way player. He was being talked about as a Jordan-type player. Gave effort on both ends, had the athleticism, 6'6", had the wingspan, the long arms, right? Ron Harper gave the effort on the defensive end, right? Ron Harper used to go back and forth with Michael Jordan when the Cleveland Cavaliers would play the Chicago Bulls, right? It was Craig Elo and Ron Harper as the main defensive guys on Michael Jordan. And Ron Harper, like I said, before he had that knee injury in about, 94, I think that was, he was an excellent, a very good two-way player, guys, very good. So shout out to Ron Harper. Derek Harper, another two-way player at that point guard position. Derek Harper, about 6'4", 6'5", man. Played for the New York Knicks for some years, man. This guy was tough, man. He was gritty. He would guard Michael Jordan. He would guard the point guards. I mean, he was just tough, man. Like I said, one of the grittiest, hard-nosed defensive players on the Dallas Mavericks in the early 90s. Like I said, could give you about 17, 18 points a game and really make it tough for you on the defensive end because of his big body and his effort that he gave, the hustle. A very good position defensive player, Derek Harper, man. So shout out to him. Mookie Blaylock, to me, another very good defensive two-way player of the 90s. The point guard for the Atlanta Hawks for many years. Played with Dominique Wilkins, Kevin Willis, Christian Laettner, Dikembe Mutombo. Mookie Blaylock, I believe he's a 6-time all-defensive player at that point guard position. This guy could just get steals, man. He was a steal magnet. He would steal the ball all over the place, man. Led the league in steals several times. Just really great at getting steals, man. The quick hands. So shout out to Mookie Blaylock, man. Another guy who's forgotten, that really never gets talked about in the 90s, but this guy was a solid two-way player in the 90s, guys. So yes, guys, as you can see, man, I know this video's going kind of long. You can see the amount of players that were really good to great to legendary two-way players in the 90s. I know I probably may have missed some guys. I try to think of these guys off the top of my head and think about the top guys I remember, you know, and watching these guys play on both ends. And as you guys can see, these are legendary two-way players. Jordan, Olajuwon, Robinson, Joe Dumars, Scotty Pippen, John Stockton, Alonzo Mourning, Patrick Ewing, Gary Payton. I mean, these guys are legendary two-way players, man. Some of the greatest defensive players in NBA's history. Like I said, to me, you're talking about Michael Jordan, Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, Gary Payton, Scottie Pippen. To me, those guys, 5 guys, are top 10 defensive players in the history of the NBA. You know, we could throw in guys like, you know, Bill Russell and Dennis Rodman, Wilt Chamberlain, Tim Duncan, you know, as some of the other great or top 10 defensive players in NBA's history. We could debate these guys. But you're talking about the 90s alone had, to me, arguably 5 of the greatest defensive players in the history of the game, guys. And not only were they great defensive players, they were also two-way players, great two-way players. So shout out to the 90s, guys, all the guys who gave effort on the defensive end. Even if these guys were not great defensive players, like I said, they gave the effort, right? They showed up and they played hard. John Stockton, Karl Malone, right? These guys showed up. Kevin McHale. They were there. They gave the effort. Ron Harper, Derek Harper, Kendall Gill, right? Reggie Lewis. They were there, man. We think about some of the players from this era, the last, 15 seasons, let's say since about 2010, 11, 12, when the defense really became nothing, right? If you think about some of the great defensive players over the last 10, 15 seasons, there's not many great two-way players. There isn't. Who do we think about? Maybe a Kawhi Leonard, right, as a great two-way player, but he's not really that durable, right? He's not there every single year. He needs to load manage to be great, right? But he's a great two-way player, right? Dwayne Wade, a great two-way player of the 2010s. Luol Deng, Paul George, Chris Paul, Dwight Howard. Maybe these are some of the guys you think about for the 2010s, right? And now we have this era now. Who are the great two-way players of this era? Giannis, Jaren Jackson Jr. I mean, you don't really have the great two-way players. Rudy Gobert's not a great two-way player to me. He's not. Marcus Smart, no. You know, these guys are just not great two-way players. You know, Rajon Rondo, was he a great two-way player? No, he couldn't really do anything on offense. No offensive game. This is why I didn't include a Dikembe Mutombo as the great two-way players of the 90s, because to me, his offensive was lacking. He didn't have the offensive skills, you know, or potency to be considered a great two-way player. So yes, guys, as you can see, man, the 90s had some great two-way players. These guys gave effort. I mean, let's be honest, guys. Most players back in the day, they gave the effort. That's the key here on the defensive end, right? They didn't just stand around, go through the motions, rest on defense for offense, right? They showed up. These guys didn't load manage. They battled against each other. And all these guys that I mentioned, like I said, I might have missed some guys, man, but you can clearly see that the 90s, the era that they're always trying to tear down because of Michael Jordan, you can see these are some of the greatest defensive players and some of the greatest two-way players in the history of the sport, guys. History of the sport, man. You guys know the deal, man. I'll catch you guys on the next one.